He was brutal. We hear about sort of massacres and the bloodshed that was connected to the time that he had the rule over Judea. He was not a nice person.
Biblical scholars have just made a very surprising and unexpected discovery. A letter written by Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor who sentenced Jesus Christ to death by crucifixion, was found in old biblical documents.
When you study the New Testament, you've got dozens and in fact hundreds of manuscripts from the first 3 or 4 or 5 centuries.
This long hidden letter has exposed some secrets and confirmed retained things the Bible revealed regarding Jesus' death. What does the letter contain, and what were Pilate's true intentions when he sentenced Jesus to be crucified? If you're curious to find out, then join us as we let you in on Pilate's confessions and how he got involved in Jesus' death. The unforgettable trial of Jesus Christ. In one of the letters believed to have been written by Pontius Pilate, he confirmed his position when he finally came face to face with Jesus and what really happened.
When Pilate calls Jesus to him, you have the extraordinary moment of a Roman governor and Jesus, face to face. You have the ultimate representative of Roman power, and you have this brigand, a common criminal as far as he knew.
Pontius Pilate was the Roman leader who governed Judea from 26 to 37 AD, but he is more famous for being the judge who sentenced Jesus to death by crucifixion. According to Christian tradition, Pilate was hesitant to condemn Jesus. He even informed the emperor of the circumstances of Jesus' crucifixion in his letter. In the same letter, he told Emperor Claudius of the Jews' plan to kill the Savior, described Christ's miracles, and related that the Jews accused Jesus of more than you can imagine, which we will reveal shortly. He eventually gave in to the demands of the Jewish leaders. And interestingly, some Christian traditions believe that Pilate later converted to Christianity and is honored as a martyr and saint. Before Pilate sentenced Jesus, Jesus was brought before the Jewish high priest Caiaphas, who orchestrated a trial against him. The Jewish leaders were desperate to find evidence to condemn Jesus to death, but despite their efforts, they couldn't find any. Eventually, Jesus was accused of claiming to be the Messiah, the Son of God, which was seen as blasphemy by the Jewish leaders. They found him guilty and physically attacked him. The Jewish leaders then took Jesus to Pontius Pilate, who had the authority to carry out capital punishment. They accused Jesus of corrupting their people and declaring himself a king. But you should know that Jesus never instructed people to withhold taxes from the Roman authorities. This isn't even half of what we have to reveal to you, so keep watching because you don't want to miss what's next. The Sabbath healing. Before we get back to Jesus' trial, what else was he accused of? Well, the stories in the Gospels tell us about times when Jesus healed people on the Sabbath, a special day for rest and worship. While these healings often led to arguments with the religious leaders, one story in Luke tells of a healing on the Sabbath without any confrontation. This healing took place in a private home, not in a public place like a synagogue. Jesus knew the rules the Pharisees had about the Sabbath, but he chose to heal on that day anyway. When Jesus healed on the Sabbath, he wasn't breaking God's law, but rather going against how the Pharisees understood and followed the law. Jesus came to fulfill the law, not to get rid of it. He healed on the Sabbath because people needed his help, and to show that the Pharisees were being hypocritical in their religious practices. Jesus wanted to teach them and others that showing love and compassion should always come first, even if it meant breaking some of the rules that people had made up. Jesus' healings on the Sabbath led to debates with the Pharisees, who questioned why he was breaking their rules. Jesus pointed out the hypocrisy of their actions, highlighting how they would tend to their animals on the Sabbath, but questioned his actions in helping a fellow human being. He asked them if they would not untie their ox or donkey on the Sabbath to lead it to water, exposing their double standard. Jesus' actions challenged the Pharisees' interpretation of Sabbath laws, and his question about whether it is lawful to do good or harm on the Sabbath left them silent. Jesus' healings on the Sabbath demonstrated that prioritizing kindness and preserving life transcends any rigid adherence to Sabbath regulations. In contrast, using Sabbath rules as a pretext for harm or cruelty was shown to be a distortion of divine law. Jesus' actions were in line with what God intended for the Sabbath, which was to benefit humans, not the other way around. The Sabbath was a chance for people to recover, shift their attention to God, and show love and compassion to others. Jesus' story reminds us to regularly check our beliefs and make sure they match up with what the Bible says. Jesus' timeless message of redemption. Next, Jesus also faced a serious accusation that he claimed he could destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days.
Tear down this temple, and in 3 days I will build it again.
Are you going to build it again in 3 days?
But Jesus' statement had a deeper meaning. He was referring to his own death and resurrection, which would happen in 3 days. Jesus understood his divine mission, which was not about overthrowing earthly powers, but about fulfilling a higher purpose. His disciples, however, had different expectations, believing Jesus would establish an earthly kingdom. Jesus' actions and teachings often challenged the expectations of his disciples and the religious leaders. For example, he deliberately ate with sinners, including tax collectors, to demonstrate his message of redemption and inclusion. This act symbolized Jesus' mission to seek and save the lost. He came not for the righteous, but for those who recognized their need for spiritual healing. Jesus' teachings emphasized love, forgiveness, and acceptance for all. In Jesus' time, religious leaders, particularly the Pharisees, held significant respect in Jewish society, but they distanced themselves from those they deemed as sinners. Jesus, on the other hand, deliberately chose to associate with tax collectors and sinners, emphasizing the availability of repentance and forgiveness. Jesus' ministry expanded, and his popularity grew among society's outcasts, offering them hope and inclusion in a way that was previously unimaginable. Throughout his ministry, Jesus consistently reached out to those who needed him. He engaged in conversations with people from different backgrounds, forgave those who were considered immoral, and showed compassion to the marginalized. Jesus' actions exemplified his belief in looking beyond cultural boundaries and recognizing the humanity in everyone. He rose beyond customs and culture, and his ministry was all about compassion. It doesn't end there. Jesus' encounter with Pilate and Herod. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, asked Jesus if he was the king of the Jews. Jesus didn't directly answer. Instead, he hinted that the label wasn't his own choice. Pilate was curious but not interested in the truth of Jesus' teachings. He was more concerned about the political implications. After questioning Jesus, Pilate declared that Jesus had done nothing wrong and didn't deserve to be crucified. Pilate then sent Jesus to Herod Antipas, who ruled over Galilee because he knew Herod had authority over the region. Herod was excited to meet Jesus, having heard a lot about him, but Jesus didn't respond to Herod's questions. The religious leaders continued to accuse Jesus, and the whole situation was strange. Herod knew about Jesus' activities in Galilee and was curious, but not interested in religion. Herod and his people made fun of Jesus, dressing him up in fancy clothes before sending him back to Pilate. Jesus didn't bother answering Herod's questions because he wasn't interested in Herod's curiosity. Herod's treatment of Jesus was disrespectful, and he was trying to show off his power. This behavior was also about maintaining his reputation, especially when faced with someone who seemed threatening. The relationship between Herod and Pilate was complicated, but dealing with Jesus brought them together. Pilate's decision to punish Jesus, despite knowing he was innocent, shows the pressure he was under from Jewish leaders. Pilate was more concerned with maintaining order and stability than with doing what was fair. This led to Jesus being treated unfairly, even though he had done nothing wrong. The trial of faith in ancient Rome. During the Passover festival, Pilate had a difficult decision to make. He had to choose between 2 prisoners to release: Barabbas, a troublemaker, and Jesus Christ, whom some believed to be the chosen one. Pilate sensed that jealousy played a role in bringing Jesus before him, so he asked the crowd who they wanted him to release. This moment was a turning point, as Pilate's decision would determine Jesus' fate. Pilate's wife had a dream that convinced her of Jesus' innocence, and she warned her husband not to condemn him. Despite this, Pilate's decision was influenced by the high priests and elders, who were determined to see Jesus executed. They gathered a mob to support their demands, creating a chaotic scene. The leaders' intense desire to see Jesus spill his blood led them to demand Barabbas's release, a known criminal who had committed serious crimes. The crowd's demand to release Barabbas and crucify Jesus confused Pilate. He asked the crowd again, but they shouted even louder, demanding Jesus' crucifixion. Pilate, troubled by their insistence, questioned why they were so adamant. He stated that he found no fault in Jesus deserving such punishment and suggested a lighter punishment. But the crowd's uproar only grew louder, insisting on Jesus' crucifixion until Pilate had no choice but to give in to their demands. Jesus was accused by the Jewish leaders of breaking their religious rules, such as healing people on the Sabbath, but Jesus taught that helping others was more important than following rules strictly. He even healed a man's withered hand on the Sabbath, which further angered the religious leaders. They teamed up with the Herodians to plan against Jesus, who continued to challenge their authority and do things they didn't understand. That's not all. The compassionate Savior. Jesus came to rescue people who had done wrong, and he didn't care if some people disapproved because of their customs or culture. What mattered was saving souls, and Jesus was all about compassion, always looking out for others and sharing God's teachings. He wasn't afraid to mingle with those considered bad by society, showing that everyone deserves kindness and understanding. By spending time with them and sharing meals, Jesus had a big impact on those labeled as sinners who could see him for who he really was, a good person close to God. One interesting incident that shows Jesus' love and forgiveness is when a woman was caught in adultery. The scribes and Pharisees brought her to Jesus, accusing her and demanding that she be stoned according to the law of Moses. But Jesus reacted with calmness, kneeling on the dusty floor and drawing in the sand. He then told the crowd that the person who hadn't done anything wrong should be the first to throw a stone at her. One by one, the people left, realizing they weren't perfect either. Jesus was left alone with the woman, and he told her that he didn't condemn her, advising her to live better from now on. This story shows Jesus' ability to overcome delicate situations, challenging the hypocrisy of those who were quick to judge others while ignoring their flaws. Jesus' response emphasizes the importance of mercy and understanding in human interactions. The event also draws attention to how complicated the power dynamics and political expediency in the ancient world was, as Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, condemned Jesus to death, despite finding no fault in him. Jesus' willingness to endure crucifixion, a gruesome and painful method of punishment, proves the depth of his sacrifice and commitment to his mission. The tomb in the Kidron Valley. In the Kidron Valley, near some famous religious sites like the Garden of Gethsemane and the Church of All Nations, there is a holy tomb that many Eastern Christians have revealed belongs to the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus. After being sealed for thousands of years, the world was expectant of what would be found inside.
Well, I think that's it, isn't it? That's not the entrance to the tomb. We're in the tomb.
When it was finally opened, it was completely empty. The books that claimed the Virgin Mary did not ascend to heaven have now been proven wrong, while the Christian beliefs that Mary went up to heaven with her body alive and intact seem to explain why no trace of her was left in the tomb. These Christian beliefs call this the Assumption, but as if to spice things up, there are some strange differences in how each Christian belief thinks about Mary's life and death, especially Catholicism and Eastern Christianity, and they are so contrasting that it's a very interesting thing to talk about.
We're standing outside the Church of the Sepulcher of St. Mary here in Jerusalem, the place where it was traditionally believed that Mary's Assumption took place.
First off, Catholics believe Mary never died in the first place, while Eastern Christians think she did die, but was buried and then came back to life on the third day, just like Jesus. After that, she went up to heaven. The Assumption of Mary is one of 4 important beliefs about Mary. The Pope, Pius XII, officially announced this teaching on November 1, 1950, in a document called Munificentissimus Deus. This teaching is connected to another important belief, the Immaculate Conception, which says Mary was born without sin. Both of these beliefs are based on the idea that Mary is the mother of Jesus, who is considered the Son of God. The Assumption of Mary doesn't specifically say whether Mary died or not, but rather that she was taken up to heaven. The Eastern Orthodox Church has a similar belief, called the Dormition of the Mother of God, which means falling asleep. This belief is not considered a dogma or official teaching in the Eastern Orthodox Church, but it is still an important part of their tradition. Pope Pius XII wrote a letter called Munificentissimus Deus, where he said that he hoped believing in Mary's Assumption would make people's belief in their own resurrection stronger. He wants people to know that just like Mary's body was taken up to heaven, our bodies will also be resurrected and taken up to heaven. There are different stories about where Mary's Assumption happened, and we'll get into that later in the video. But before that, did you know that around the 7th century, a new story circulated about Mary's Assumption? This story says that one of Jesus' apostles, often called Thomas, wasn't there when Mary died, but when he finally arrived, they opened her tomb again and found it empty, except for the clothes she was wearing. This story was later told and retold, and some versions even say that Mary dropped her belt down from heaven to Thomas as proof that she was taken up to heaven. This story is shown in many paintings of Mary's Assumption. The teaching about Mary's Assumption spread throughout the Christian world, and people started celebrating it as early as the 5th century. The Emperor Maurice made it an official holiday in the Eastern Roman Empire around the year 600. Some scholars think that the stories about Mary's Assumption and Dormition, or falling asleep, can be traced back to ancient Christian books that aren't even part of the Bible we use today. Some scholars who study the Bible think that a group of Jewish Christians in Jerusalem knew stories about the end of Mary's life, which were passed down through word of mouth. They believe that these stories were shared during the time of the apostles or soon after, and that they are based on real events. By looking at these oral traditions, they are trying to show that the stories about Mary's Assumption and Dormition are true. But another scholar named Shoemaker points out that these stories are very different from each other and don't come from one tradition. Instead, they come from many different sources and have gone as far as evolving over time. Even the scholars who believe in the oral traditions agree that the belief in Mary's Assumption as we know it today is the result of a long process of development, rather than the original story itself. The story of Mary's Assumption first appeared in a book called the Liber Requiae Mariae, or Book of Mary's Repose, which was written in the 2nd or 3rd century. This book is not considered entirely trustworthy, and its beliefs about Mary are quite different from what most Christians believe. The old stories about Mary's Assumption are not clear and don't all agree on what happened. Some stories support the belief that Mary was taken up to heaven, while others don't. According to Stephen J. Shoemaker, there is no evidence that people believed in Mary's Assumption before the 5th century. The only exception is that Epiphanius of Salamis tried to find out how Mary's life ended in the 4th century, but he couldn't find any reliable information. Now here's where things get quite funny. It turns out the New Testament doesn't say anything about how Mary's life ended, and the early Christians didn't write any accounts of her death. Even though Epiphanius couldn't find any trustworthy tradition about how Mary's life ended, his writings show that people were already disagreeing about what happened to her. He mentioned 3 different beliefs. Some people thought Mary died a peaceful death, others thought she died as a martyr, and others believed she didn't die at all. Epiphanius also wrote that Mary was like Elijah, who was taken up to heaven without dying.
Mary was assumed into heaven at the end of her earthly life. She was taken up body and soul into heaven.
This idea was repeated in later writings that aren't considered entirely trustworthy, like De Obitu Est Domini and De Transitu Virginis, which were probably written in the 5th century. Other writers like Dionysius the Areopagite and Gregory of Tours also shared similar stories. These writings helped spread the belief in Mary's Assumption, which was considered unofficial until the 6th century, but by the 8th century, the belief had become widely accepted, and John of Damascus wrote that Mary died in the presence of the apostles, but when they got to her tomb, they were in for a shock. Her tomb was found empty when they opened it, leading them to believe her body was taken up to heaven. The celebration of Mary's Dormition, which was brought from the Eastern Church, arrived in the Western Church in the 7th century. Over time, the name of the celebration changed to the Assumption in some religious calendars in the 9th century. In the same century, Pope Leo IV made the feast day more important by adding a vigil and an octave, which are special religious ceremonies. Later, Pope Nicholas I placed the Assumption on the same level as Christmas and Easter, which are two of the most important holidays in the Christian calendar. Then, in the 12th century, a German nun named Elizabeth of Schonau had visions of Mary and Jesus that greatly influenced the Western Church's belief in Mary's Assumption. Later, Pope Benedict XIV declared that believing in Mary's Assumption was a reasonable opinion, and that not believing in it would be disrespectful to God. On May 1, 1950, a man named Gilles Bours, who claimed to have seen the Virgin Mary, told Pope Pius XIV a message that he said Mary wanted him to share with the Pope. The message was about the Assumption of Mary, which is the belief that Mary was taken up to heaven. Pope Pius XII had been praying for a sign to confirm that this belief was true, and he took Gilles' message as that sign. 6 months later, on November 1, 1950, the Pope officially declared the Assumption of Mary as a dogma, which is basically a belief that is considered absolutely true by the Catholic Church. What makes the whole thing more complicated is that not all Catholics believe the same thing about Mary's Assumption. Keep watching because your belief might be one of them. More beliefs of Mary's ascension into heaven. Some Catholics believe that Mary died before she was taken up to heaven, but they also believe that she was brought back to life by a miracle before being assumed. This belief is called the moralistic interpretation. There are also some Catholics who believe that Mary was taken up to heaven without dying first, which is called the immortalistic interpretation. Others believe that she died and was then taken up to heaven, which is called the mortalistic interpretation. The last two beliefs are allowed in the Catholic Church, and Eastern Catholics celebrate the feast day as the Dormition. But many signs in Catholic traditions, such as prayers, stories, and art, suggest that the mortalistic interpretation is more widely accepted. Remember that St. Pope John Paul II publicly expressed the mortalistic belief. The Catholic Church celebrates the Feast of the Assumption on August 15th, while the Eastern Orthodox and Eastern Catholic churches celebrate the Dormition of the Mother of God on the same date. Before the feast, Eastern Christians fast for 14 days to honor Mary's life and death. They believe that Mary died a natural death, but that her soul was taken up by Christ immediately. They also believe that her body was resurrected after her death and taken up into heaven, where she awaits the general resurrection of all believers. Protestant beliefs about Mary's Assumption vary, with some groups closer to Catholicism believing in a bodily assumption, while most Protestants do not. In the Anglican tradition, there is also a range of beliefs, with some accepting the Assumption, others rejecting it, and some considering it a matter of indifference. Although the doctrine was largely absent from Anglican worship for many years, it experienced a resurgence in the 20th century among Anglo-Catholic groups who celebrated it under different names. Today, different Anglican churches celebrate a feast day on August 15th, but with different names and focuses. The Church of England honors the Blessed Virgin Mary without specifying the Assumption, while the Scottish Episcopal Church simply calls it Mary the Virgin. In the United States, the Episcopal Church celebrates Saint Mary the Virgin, Mother of our Lord Jesus Christ, while other provinces, like the Anglican Church of Canada, mark the day as the falling asleep of the Blessed Virgin Mary, which is another way of referring to the Dormition. For hundreds of years, the tomb of Jesus Christ in the Church of the Holy Sepulcher in Jerusalem has been covered with a layer of marble, but in October 2016, a team of scientists finally got to see what was underneath. They were working on a project to fix up the tomb in the church, and they were excited to learn more about this important place. When the scientists removed the marble, they found a lot of extra material underneath. They were surprised by how much was there. Now they get to study the original rock that Jesus' body was laid on, according to Christian belief. That's not all. According to the Christian faith, Jesus Christ was killed by the Romans and then placed in a special spot in a cave. This spot was like a shelf, carved out of the rock of the cave. This event happened either in the year 30 or 33. Christians believe that Jesus came back to life after he died, and when some women went to visit his body a few days later, they found that it was gone. The shelf where Jesus was placed is now inside a small building called the Edicule, which is like a little house. This building was rebuilt between 1808 and 1810 after it was damaged in a fire. Since 2017, a team of scientists from Greece has been working to fix up the edicule and the tomb inside it. They are being led by a woman named Professor Antonia Maropoulou, who is in charge of the project. Scientists are very excited because they finally get to see and study a very important place that has been hidden under a thick layer of marble for so long. By studying the original rock of the tomb, scientists can learn more about what the tomb looked like a long time ago and how it has changed over time. They can also learn about how people have been honoring and respecting this place for a very long time. The scientists are using special tools and techniques to study the tomb and take detailed pictures and notes. This will allow people from all over the world to see and learn about the tomb as if they were actually there. The leader of the project, Professor Antonia Maropoulou, says that they are at a very important moment in their work, and that the special ways they are used to study the tomb will help everyone learn more about this unique and special place. The church closed early. So many people who were visiting from other places were standing outside, confused, because they couldn't get in. Inside the church, there were lots of different people, like workers wearing yellow hats, monks wearing brown robes, priests wearing black hats, and others wearing special hoods. They were all gathered around the special tomb called the edicule, trying to get a look inside. The tomb is usually dimly lit by candles, but this time it was brightly lit, showing off details that are usually hard to see. The special tomb is surrounded by a fancy building that was built in the 1800s. Right now, that building is covered in beams and safety tape. Inside the tomb, the special slab of marble that covers the important bench had been pulled away from the wall. This slab is about as big as a door and is made of white marble with a smooth finish. Underneath the marble slab, there was a stone surface that was a gray-beige color. When someone asked what it was, the person in charge of taking care of the tomb said they weren't sure yet, but it was time to use special tools to figure it out. The Church of the Holy Sepulcher, which is also called the Church of the Resurrection, is a very important place for many different groups of Christians. 6 groups take care of the church, and 3 of them, the Greek Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and the Armenian Orthodox Church, are in charge of making big decisions. The other 3 groups, the Coptic, Ethiopian Orthodox, and Syriac communities, also have a say in what happens at the church. The church has some special areas that all the groups use together, and one of those areas is the tomb where Jesus is said to have been buried. The Church of the Holy Sepulcher, and another church called Mary's Tomb, which was built around the same time in the 4th century AD, are visited by many people every year. The special building that houses Mary's tomb has been destroyed and rebuilt many times over the years. The building that stands today was constructed by a group of Franciscan friars in the 14th century. The Greek Orthodox Church is the main caretaker of the building, but they share some responsibilities with other Christian groups. To reach Mary's tomb, visitors must go down a long staircase that is over 1,000 years old. On the way down, they pass by 2 smaller chapels, one dedicated to Mary's husband, Joseph, and another dedicated to her parents. When they reach the tomb, they have to duck down to enter the small space. Inside, they are surrounded by beautiful religious art and icons from the Middle Ages. The atmosphere is peaceful and reverent, as pilgrims come to pray and light candles. Before scientists finally found Mary's resting place, there were several spots believed to be where she was buried, and you won't believe how some traditions have justified their claims. Some places where people believed the Virgin Mary was buried. There are different beliefs about the tomb of the Virgin Mary. The Turkmen Karaits believe that Mary's tomb is in a town called Mary in Turkmenistan, which used to be named Mari. This belief comes from a tradition called Nestorian. Another belief comes from Christians in a place called Nineveh in northern Iraq. They think Mary's tomb is near a city called Erbil, and they link it to a mosque in a city called Mosul. The Ahmadiyya movement thinks Mary's tomb is in a town called Muri in Pakistan. They believe her tomb is now in a special place called Mai Mari da Ashtan. But if these places claim she died in their tombs, how did she get there? There are many stories and legends about the Virgin Mary's travels after Jesus' death. Remember the one involving Thomas we talked about that was circulating sometime around the 7th century? Well, the story didn't end there. It claimed Mary went to India with Thomas the Apostle, where she passed away in a town called Mari, which is now part of Turkmenistan. According to this story, Thomas was the only apostle who saw Mary's body rise to heaven, while the others were taken to Jerusalem to see her die. The story says Thomas was left in India until after Mary's first burial, when he was suddenly taken to her tomb and saw her body rise to heaven, leaving behind only her belt. The other apostles didn't believe Thomas when he told them what he saw, but later they found Mary's tomb empty, except for her belt. This story was often told with drawings and paintings during the Middle Ages and early Renaissance. There's another legend that says Mary traveled to the Middle East and died in a town called Mari, which, remember, is in modern-day Turkmenistan. What do you think about Pontius Pilate's letter regarding Jesus' death? We would love to know in the comments. If you enjoyed watching this video, don't forget to leave a like, share it with your family and friends, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next updates. Also, click the next video on your screen to enjoy more exciting content.